Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to this session on content moderation practices of social media platforms and their impact on social cohesion. In this session, we will discuss freedom of expression on social media. We will discuss the spread of harmful content online, and we will also discuss harmful content versus peace-building narratives. We'll discuss how global challenges translate at local level, with concrete examples across 3 continents. My name is Adeline Nulin. I'm working for the UNESCO Brussels office, and I'm the project coordinator of the project Social Media for Peace, which gathers us here today. For this session today, I am joined by an amazing panel of experts, which I would like to briefly introduce to you. We have Mrs. Frances Hogan, advocate for accountability and transparency in social media, who is joining us remotely. Good morning, Mrs. Hogan, and thank you so much for having accepted our invitation today.
Good morning.
Mrs. Hogan was recruited to Facebook in 2019 to be the lead product manager on civic misinformation team, which dealt with issues related to democracy and misinformation. Last year, she made the courageous decision to blow the whistle on Facebook. Her initial reporting was done by the Wall Street Journal in what became known as the Facebook file. So welcome, Mrs. Hogan. We're thrilled to have you with us. Also with us today, yet next to me in person, is Mrs. Quinn McKew, the Executive Director of Article 19. Since joining Article 19 in 2011, she's played a vital role in developing a world-leading program of work on digital infrastructure and human rights, and has become a leading voice on the protection of the civic space and human rights from a human rights perspective. Important for our discussion today, Article 19 is one of the main partners of the project Social Media for Peace. So welcome, and thanks a lot for being here with us. Next, we have Mr. João Brandt. He's a researcher and consultant in communication, internet, and cultural policies. Mr. Brandt is currently director of Instituto, Cultura e Democracia, and he coordinates a project called Desinformante. And he has, in the past months, worked as a consultant for the UNESCO project Social Media for Peace to compile the main findings of our work in the 3 pilot countries. So we are very much looking forward to hear about that. Thank you so much. And last, Mr. Gabriel Parra is also with us. He's the Regional Public Policy Manager for the Asociación Latinoamericana de Internet. Mr. Parra has more than 10 years of experience in the technology industry in Latin America, and he currently leads the public policy efforts of ALAI in Spanish-speaking South America to guide discussion for smarter tech policies. Thank you so much. Before we start the session, let me just mention 2 quick points. The first one is that at the end of this session, we will screen a very short video about concrete example of UNESCO's work with social media platform, notably our education sector in relation to the Holocaust denial. And right now, we wanted to start this session in order to frame and actually sum up what we have been doing in the past year. It's a project that started 1 year ago, with a small video that actually introduced and framed the discussion. So if the technician can...
In our digital world, advances in technology have completely changed the way we access and share information. Social media has enabled us to shift from being passive receivers of information to becoming producers and editors of content, giving more people a voice, and taking us closer to achieving more inclusive, just and peaceful societies, which lie at the heart of Sustainable Development Goal 16. But there are also growing concerns around the use of social media as an instrumental platform to spread harmful content, such as hate speech and disinformation. This has had significant impacts on conflict dynamics and peace. For instance, in 2018, Facebook recognized that the platform was being misused in Myanmar to fuel division and incite offline violence against the Rohingya people. More recently, following the riots at the US Capitol building in 2021, Twitter and other companies suspended Donald Trump's account, arguing there'd be a risk of further incitement to violence. While it's difficult to establish that online hate speech or disinformation directly causes or correlates to offline violence, there is growing evidence that some violence has been instigated online. Every second, more than 10,000 posts are shared on social media. To moderate this huge amount of content, platforms are using a mix of automated and human interventions, and increasingly relying on artificial intelligence to detect hate speech and disinformation. But social media platforms admit they have limited capacity when it comes to training AI in minority languages, or having trained human moderators who speak these languages. What this means is that content moderation cannot be applied universally. And incitement to violence and disinformation can spread faster in developing and conflict-prone countries, where there are already political tensions. Another issue is that we cannot bar every hateful word or piece of false information without taking local context into account. For example, in most countries, a dog is just a dog. But in some places, the word dog is used as a derogatory term to insult a specific group of people. If we rely on AI alone to take down content, a lot of legitimate and legal content will also be removed, with a chilling impact on freedom of expression. To address these challenges, we urgently need to find global solutions that can be adapted to local contexts. This is the aim of UNESCO's new project, Social Media for Peace. Launched in early 2021 and funded by the European Union's instrument contributing to stability and peace, the project is being piloted in 3 countries: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Indonesia, and Kenya. In each of these countries, UNESCO is investing in research to analyze how harmful content is circulating and consulting with communities that are most affected. We're also mapping how these issues are being addressed by local authorities and social media platforms through community guidelines and legal regulations. Bringing together multiple stakeholders, including tech companies, researchers, civil society organizations, media, and peace-building communities, the project will use the research findings to help define solutions that can effectively curb harmful online content at a local level. Lessons learned on the ground can help to drive stronger global solutions and promote the use of social media for peace in every country across the world.
Thank you. So, well, Mrs. Hogan, let me start with you. As we've seen in this short clip, and also like in general, we've heard that social media platforms have been at the center of criticism in relation to their content moderation practices, and notably the fact that they would amplify harmful narratives and polarizing content, which impacts on democracy and conflict in some societies locally. And so based on your professional experience, do you agree with those criticisms? And why do you believe a project like Social Media for Peace could make a meaningful difference? Because notably, it's, as we just saw, it's aiming at localizing, at least providing some solution for localizing content moderation practices.
One of the core parts of my disclosures to the SEC and Congress in the United States was that Facebook's algorithms were changed in 2018 such that content that was more likely to elicit a reaction, so that could be a comment, could be a reshare, it could be a like, was more likely, would get more distribution. This combined with Facebook's over-reliance on large, unmoderated groups, even moderated internally, I'm not even saying externally moderated, causes a situation where there are these points of amplification where there might be 500,000 or 1 million people in each of these groups. And each day that group might make 1,000, 5,000 pieces of content. But Facebook has to choose using an algorithm, maybe 5 or 10 pieces of content to actually show you in your newsfeed so you don't get swamped. When you have an algorithm that biases towards content, or actively prioritizes content that gets a reaction, because the shortest path to a click is hate, anger, fear, you end up having a system that biases towards extreme content. When you combine these two things together, these hyper amplification points for the large groups and an algorithm that when it filters out, just a few pieces of content for you to see, biases towards things that get that emotional reaction, you get a system where the most extreme ideas get the most distribution. The most important part of the clip we just watched is a discussion on how should decisions be made around which languages to support and how much relative investment in the form of either engineering time to build AI or in just literally human moderators. How should those allocation decisions be made? Right now, Facebook makes the least amount of money from parts of the world that are the most fragile. So for example, for the United States and Canada, they make about $55 per quarter. For Europe, they make $14.50. For Asia, they make, which is a large heterogeneous group, it makes about $4.50. And for the rest of the world, it only makes about $2.50. And so you can see here, the business model has some pretty big challenges because some of the most fragile places in the world, they also make the least money. But those fragile places are also the most linguistically diverse. The last thing I wanted to touch on was something raised in the clip, which was the example of how the word dog is used can be a great example of dialectical differences also. That you can have a single larger language family, like say Spanish, but there can be very different slurs in each individual country. As the clip said, context is really important. One of the biggest leaps forward that humanity can do is to start having conversations about how the data that is used to train these AIs is produced, and then make sure that we have equitable ways of making sure that every language in the world is safe. We need linguistic equity, and the only way we'll get that is by having a large public conversation about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Let me maybe just quickly ask you, because we mentioned so concretely about these 3 countries, that we've been working on. What would you then recommend, like, how this project could really make a meaningful difference, in your opinion? Apart from maybe raising some of the issues, but also like, what do you, because in the second part of the project, we're planning as well to pilot some solutions. So just wondering what would be your thoughts about what would be the contribution of this project?
I think we need to have a conversation about how can local communities be involved in labeling data for training AI. I personally think AI is, so my personal recommendation for how we make these systems safer is that we focus much more on the product design choices. So that's things like, should there be hundreds of thousands or millions of person groups that are where our attention is focused within them using AI? Or should we be focusing on smaller groups, like 30,000 person groups that are using chronological feeds? My personal bias is that moderation systems are not very effective. That even for languages that Facebook does support, like English, they still only get 3 to 5% of the hate speech. And so a larger impact is pushing these platforms for transparency, because if we could see which content was getting the most distribution, we would demand product changes, and pushing for transparency on outcomes of these moderation systems. So for example, we could be saying, you need to be showing us 100 samples for each of the languages that you support at each of your scoring percentiles, because that would allow us to actually supervise them and say, are there too many false positives? Are you taking down the wrong content? Because I want to give an example. In Arabic, at least, for some dialects, 75% of the counterterrorism speech was getting labeled as terrorism speech. The only way we can know that these systems are performing so badly is if we're actually allowed to see and inspect the performance of these systems directly. So that's the thing I've been recommending.
Thank you. Well, then let me turn to you, Mrs. McKew. We've heard right now from Mrs. Hogan some of the main issues in relation to content moderation practices in pilot countries, and here the experience based from Facebook. But your research that Article 19 has been conducting is wider. It's about all social media platforms in these 3 pilot countries. So do the findings of this research are matching as well what we've just heard from Mrs. Hogan?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us here to be part of this panel. And thank you to Frances Hogan for the revelations that you put out there that have really helped advance a lot of the discussion on this around the world. The research that Article 19 was doing on this project in those 3 countries, I think found a lot of things that are very resonant with what has just been shared. Core of that is the idea that context is being completely missed, and people are feeling very separate from the decisions that are being made about the content in in different countries. They don't have faith that they're being treated fairly. They don't have understanding about how decisions are made, and they don't know how to address improper takedowns or things that are left up improperly, because there's very little to no transparency or communication between nearly any social media platform, not just Facebook, nearly any social media platform, and the citizens in particular countries themselves. The lack of context is a thing that comes through over and over again. I mean, there were some good examples in the video about the word dog meaning different things in different places. Even in, I mean, just taking English, for example, things that are a slur in one place are definitely not in another. But then you take a linguistically complex country like Kenya with so many different dialects and languages that are being spoken, and it becomes this incredibly complex, difficult challenge to actually even understand the context in that country between different communities in terms of slurs that are going around. You know, one of the things I think that's probably on a lot of our minds now around social media content is the recent takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk, and the way that it's being casually tossed about as this paradise for freedom of expression that's going to be flourishing on Twitter. And I think those of us who are experts in the community know that putting a man on the moon is actually a way easier problem than dealing with the social complexity of humans when it comes to our interactions online. And that was borne out, I think, in a lot of the research that we saw in many different places. And one of the things it's really pointing to is looking at how we can embed this, as Frances was saying, how we can embed this kind of cultural understanding in the decisions that are being made. There have been these principles that were developed a few years ago and adopted or amended more recently called the Santa Clara Principles, which are about freedom of expression and protecting freedom of expression in content moderation decisions. And one of the key principles that come through in the Santa Clara Principles is this idea of cultural competence, that content moderation needs to be based in cultural competence, that people need to have the right to understand what's going on. They need the rights to have, even how content moderation decisions are decided, those policies need to be available in their own language. Many times in the world, many places in the world, the content moderation policies or the transparency policies aren't available in a local language. It's available maybe in English. So how are people going to demand transparency and actually understand how decisions are going to be made if they can't even read it to start with? That's one of the core things that comes through in terms of just basics that are still not being gotten right. Other things come up in terms of the idea of cultural competence, of giving people the right to understand why something was being taken down, again, going into this issue of transparency, and really localizing, having the rights to have understanding of the local context be built into the way these systems are done. This is incredibly complex and incredibly costly. And this is where I think the suggestion that Frances was making about, look, we know increasingly the way that this is going to be done is automatic. It already is. The vast majority of content moderation has happened at an algorithmic level, and then some of the more problematic pieces are tossed off to humans to try and make decisions on. And I think they have an average of, 50 seconds to review content and make a decision about how that can be taken down. And so the question becomes, how do we build that cultural competence into these automated systems? And that's really key. And that is where it's absolutely crucial for there to be a multi-stakeholder approach to these things. And that's one of the things that came through in our research over and over again, is the need to involve a diverse layer of civil society organizations and others from different countries who understand the context to help build that cultural competence that's going to be needed on content moderation.
Thank you. And actually, we will speak about this local multi-stakeholder coalition a bit later. Let me now turn to you, João. If you could maybe give us a bit of an insight about the research that you've been doing in the 3 countries. It's a bit broader than the work of Article 19, because within the 3 countries, some research has been done about also not just the content moderation practices, but also about the legal framework. So if you could maybe let us know about what has been the results of this research and what are the main key takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeline. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for the audience, and a pleasure to be with Francis, Quinn, and Gabriel in this panel. I actually did a work of combining and systematizing very well done reports by local partners and by Article 19 researchers as well in the countries. And I would like to highlight at least 5 main findings that I think match with Quinn's and Francis' points as well. One is, well, there is evidence about the occurrence of hate speech and disinformation that affects and impacts offline issues. So it may sound obvious, but it is important to say, although these evidence are not provided by the platforms themselves, but are found by independent monitoring and research, and sometimes are anecdotal in the terms that we cannot have a kind of systematic approach to these things without a more deep collaboration of the platforms and being more transparent. So this is an issue. And this affects groups, mainly vulnerable groups, mainly ethnic minorities, LGBTQIA+ groups, and so we're talking about real problems in the real world. The second thing, I think by now the platforms are enforcing their policies in a, let's say, an opaque way, and inconsistent in some parts. We're talking about, I think Quinn and Francis already talked about that. We cannot actually find evidences in how, or the transparency reports, for instance, are not localized, are not country-based and country-defined. So sometimes it's very difficult to understand the situation in the countries. In Bosnia, for instance, that is on the verge of a serious conflict. There is no offices of the companies. They're based in Poland, they're based in different countries, and not actually with a consistent approach of some conflict-prone environments, such as Bosnia is at the moment. The third thing is all the issues on moderators on local languages. For instance, in Kenya, there's no moderators in Swahili, so it's part of the problem. It's to adapt the structure to the different cultural perspective and cultural diversity. And of course, we're talking about the lack of investments, of financial investments in really being in conflict-prone environments or in situations where social cohesion is being affected. The third, I think, important finding is legislation in many of these countries is vague, is excessively punitive, and do not actually protect the affected groups. It actually is being mostly used by public officials to limit criticism of ordinary citizens and vulnerable groups. So we're not talking legislation is not important. It's on the contrary, it will be and it may be important, but it cannot. It has to be aligned with international standards, with the Rabat Plan of Action, with the ICCPR, with the covenants on discrimination and etc. So it's very important to guarantee that it's not used against legitimate rights and while vulnerable groups are being affected and not protected. The third conclusion finding is that civil society is vibrant in these countries, is doing important stuff, is doing important jobs in most of them, but still fragmented, but willing to be and to work more closely, to work in coalitions, and maybe to have a kind of more consistent dialogue with the platforms, and that's related to the recommendations that we can mention after in the second round. So, of course, part of these problems we're talking about, they are really related to the historical context in the countries. But these are often being reinforced by social media dynamics, and that's the problem. We're not talking about creating new problems, although there is this case as well, but we're talking about the concern of really not reinforcing, having these social media dynamics and algorithms and etc. reinforcing these problems. And finally, I would like just to mention that existing international standards on freedom of expression and on the tackling hate speech remain very important, remain really the basis for analysis, but we should invest time and call for an interpretation that can be more updated related to this new times. I'm meaning, when you're talking, for instance, about swarming or a collective action attacking one person or attacking a vulnerable group, of course it affects the way, for instance, the Rabat Plan of Action can interpret context or can interpret reach of the content. So we should dialogue within UNESCO and UN, and Article 19 and groups that can do this job in order to update the interpretation of these international standards considering this new scenario.
Thank you so much. I will turn to you now, Mr. Parra. You've been working, helping social media platforms to guide discussion for smarter tech policies. So I'd be curious to hear a bit more about what those smarter tech policies are and in which way they are maybe interconnected or related to the discussion of today in relation to the challenges we're discussing on content moderation.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Adeline. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's great to be here with you, with Quinn, with Frances, with João. And I think it's a great question. And the short answer is there is no one-size-fits-all to smart or to sound tech policy, right? Because sound tech policy can come in many different sizes or shapes. There are, however, many different elements, and some of them critical, that we think that we should take into account when we are working on sound tech policy. So let me expand a little bit more on what are some of those elements and cover on some examples that we've been working on regarding content moderation here in Latin America. And so the first thing, if you're working on new policy, in new tech policy, you want to make sure that you are building upon existing legislation. The last thing that you want to do in an innovative industry that adds tons of value to society is to create tensions, contradictions, or unnecessary confusions in a very complex environment. And this is the case of content moderation, right? We know there are tensions between content moderation and freedom of expression, and we know that platforms stand, if you will, in the middle of those who say that freedom of expression is the most important thing, and those who think that platforms should be more strict, if you will, about content moderation. Now, this doesn't mean that sometimes regulation isn't needed, and I want to be very clear about that. There are some cases in which regulations are needed and also need to be updated, and I think this is the case, for example, of data protection laws. And so, just to give you an example, right now we're working in Chile with policymakers on their new proposal for a new policy, for a new data protection policy in Chile, which we support, by the way, because to give you a little bit of context, Chile's data protection law dates back to 1999. So clearly it is insufficient and it is not prepared for the current and future challenges. And so we're providing some recommendations on how data protection law, which is required, a new data protection law in Chile, could be more adaptable and flexible for the future. So that's one element. A second element is when you're working in tech policy, you need to make sure that you identify a specific issue and that you build a robust solution to that specific issue. And the problem that we've seen in Latin America, and this has to do a lot with content moderation, is policymakers try to pack in one bill or in one piece of legislation so many topics. And we've seen it in Peru, we've seen it in Chile. So you'll find in one proposal, you will see content moderation, you will see e-commerce, you will see access to internet, you will see internet alphabetization, you will see data protection. And clearly, this is not a good approach, because normally when you see these types of proposals, they lack the necessary debate, the multi-stakeholder dialogue that Quinn was mentioning, that is necessary to come to very specific issues that should be, separated and correctly identified. So that's a second element. And the third element is, we know that technology constantly evolves, right? And when it comes to content moderation, platforms are constantly changing or trying to improve their content moderation practices, their community guidelines, etc. When it comes to policy, we also think that they should be flexible and that they should be principle-based. Because when you focus on policy that is rigid, that is inflexible, and that is extremely prescriptive on what should or should not be done, or very specific about a specific technology, it is hard for that law to be relevant throughout the years. And so just to give you a few examples, things that are relevant that we're working, we recently joined an alliance for child safety by the Institute for Digital Development of Latin America, in which we are having a multi-stakeholder dialogue to find ways in which Latin America can do a better job in working for child safety in digital environments. We are also part of the process of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to build a healthier public debate online. And this is also a multi-stakeholder approach that we believe is relevant, and it is the right way to go. So those are three elements. I want to close my intervention by saying we know that there's a lot more work to be done. We want to collaborate more, absolutely. And in Latin America, we have a greater issue that was touched by Quinn and by João, which is we need to have our own vision, right? We need to make sure we are inclusive with our own communities, that we involve our cultural elements, so that we just not copy and paste policies from around the world, but that we actually have a multi-stakeholder dialogue with our communities, so that we create our own vision for Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you as well for giving this example. That's really interesting, especially that you mentioned the case of Latin America. And this project, Social Media for Peace, is for the moment in 3 pilot countries, not yet in Latin America, but the good news is that we are starting, and we're going to extend to Latin America very soon, and probably to Colombia. So
I would love to see that.
So that's news. Let me go back then quickly for a quick second round of questions to you, and I want to start with you, Mr. Brandt. Now you mentioned some of the main points in relation to what were the main key takeaways. Could you briefly give us then what are the key recommendations that have been highlighted by the experts in the 3 countries?
Yeah, definitely. Well, responding to the main findings, I think one thing is platforms should really invest and consider investing more and prioritizing these countries that we know that maybe commercially they are not that interesting to the platforms, but in terms of how societies are organized and conflicts are happening, it's very important. And this meaning being transparent at national level, of really bringing not transparency only about figures, but about processes and about the impacts of algorithms, considering local context, having local moderators, and all this stuff that Quinn already cited. The second thing is legislation should be reformed to adequate it to international standards, and that we know that it's very difficult. I'm bringing as a general issue, but it's important to understand how to do it, considering the ICCPR, the Rabat Plan of Action, the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, and etc. And we have to be taking vulnerable groups, putting in the middle of the discussion, like they have to be protected, not only with regulation, but with public policy. And so we should be concerned on that. Another recommendation is that civil society and companies should engage in a consistent and meaningful dialogue, trying to define and to understand, create a joint understanding of these challenges. And we're talking about training, code of conduct, and different stuff that can really arise from this. And I think UNESCO should consider launching a discussion on analyzing international standards to provide really innovative guidelines for content moderation. This, I know that's maybe bold, but I think it's important to really to discuss global problems, demand global responses, but on the other hand, we also need the local and the adaptation for local contexts, as the video was saying. So I think these are the main recommendations. Of course, there are lots of different ones, and the global report will be probably in mid of the year, will be launched as a reference as well, along with the domestic reports that are really, really interesting on the situation.
Thank you. Well, a lot of work ahead of us, indeed. And, well, yes, the reports will be launched sometime soon, so stay tuned on our webpage. We'll announce that. Mrs. McKew, going back to the work, and especially this multi-stakeholder coalition, which have been mentioned a couple of times, could you tell us maybe a little bit more about those? And also how much or how is it interconnected to the work of Article 19 in relation to the social media councils, for instance, which is a concept that has been promoted by your organization?
Thanks very much for the question. So we have the problem that's been defined. There's many aspects to it, but one of which is severe lack of actual local knowledge and contextual knowledge that leads to good content moderation decisions that protect freedom of expression and protect individuals. So we've defined that problem. It's been known for a while. One of the solutions that Article 19 has proposed is the creation of something called a social media council, which would, in essence, be a multi-stakeholder coalition that would involve people from civil society, from vulnerable groups, from the social media platforms themselves, possibly, and journalists in a country that would come together to develop and look at the standards for content moderation and develop codes of practice in different countries. This is obviously like a long-term process and a long-term goal that we could look to working towards. Now, the beauty of social media for peace is that it's positing kind of a first step of that, which is actually creating coalitions of civil society and other organizations at the national level to start talking amongst themselves, to start saying, what are those conditions of freedom of expression that we need here? How do we build our understanding of that? And how do we build understanding of how to do that and protect that on social media platforms with content moderation decisions? And so that is the next step for social media for peace, is the development of these local coalitions around freedom of expression to really look at defining what needs to be done, to build competence in local languages, to start building bridges between communities that are ultimately what's going to be needed if we're going to have effective, long-term, locally owned and locally understood content moderation that's going to take place and actually leads to a more peaceful world.
Great, thank you so much. Mr. Parra, we spoke extensively about the curbing of harmful content. We haven't had much time now to speak about as well how maybe to push for peace-building narratives online. Is this something that you could maybe address now?
Yes, absolutely, Adeline. And I love that question because it focuses on the positive sides that technology and platforms have done for society. We do believe that in the last 20, 30 years, there has been a huge advance in freedom of speech, in making information accessible to people. And so there's things that can be done. Number one, and I know this has, there's nothing new with this, but I think that the one thing that will do the greatest change is education. And I like to think of this as cars, right? In cars, we have seatbelts. We give out tickets for people who go speeding. We try to build safe cars. We try to build safe roads. But in the end, it all comes down about how drivers behave at the wheel, you know? And this is very important because I think with platforms it's very similar. Of course, we can always work on a safer environment, but in the end, it'll come down to how users behave when they are online. So I think education is the most important thing, and that we need to keep doubling down on that, especially when it comes to managing content online. If we don't want to hinder freedom of expression. Second thing, and this is I think especially true for countries in situations of violence, is I think we need a better example from our leaders, right? I'm not gonna go as far as saying that the way leaders behave online dictates the way we behave online. But I do think they influence a lot, and that they have, a huge responsibility. And so I think there needs to be more commitment from, social leaders, political leaders, for a better behavior and for a responsible behavior online. Number 3, I think this has already been touched upon, but I think there is a huge role to play by social media platforms to amplify the voices of normally excluded communities. In the case of Colombia, for example, these are women, these are victims of the armed conflict, these are Afro-Colombian communities, these are indigenous communities that normally it's harder for them to participate in, in offline and traditional channels. And so I think social media can be a huge platform for these communities to be part of the conversation, and to be engaged, and to work towards a more peaceful environment.
Thanks for this positive work, and indeed now we're running a bit out of time, but still we have a couple of more minutes, and I want to conclude the session going back to you, Mrs. Hogan. You've been very actually vocal as well, like that in pointing the power, the positive power of social media, and also to harness, how to harness their positive sides. And one of the things which has been mentioned also, like by I think Mr. Parra as well, is the legislative framework. And I want to ask you one question in relation to the legal framework indeed, and the fact that in Europe, and this is also a European funded project, there was just recently an agreement on the Digital Services Act, and I know this is something that you've been following closely. Mm-hmm. How could maybe such type of legislation, which is trying to improve the transparency of social media platforms, how could this maybe become a kind of a standard, a golden standard?
Well, it's a great first step. We need to remember that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And there are many things where we can continue to build on this amazing foundation that is the Digital Services Act, but that we deserve even more. Like, I'm extremely glad it passed. It's the biggest piece of legislation regarding social media that's passed basically ever. Probably the most essential thing about it is that it gives us the ability for the first time to ask questions independent of platforms. We need to remember something there's a very, very important fact we need to remember, which is that for a majority of languages in the world, 80 or 90% of all the content that is available on the internet is only available on Facebook. Unlike, say, the English internet, where we can build robots that go out and read web pages and allow us to understand what's actually available on the internet, Facebook went into some of the most vulnerable places in the world and bought the right to be the internet. They said, if you use Facebook, your data is free. If you use anything else on the open internet, you're gonna have to pay for it yourself. And as a result, because of these market forces, they literally ate the ability to be the internet. They are the internet for at least 1 billion people in the world. The thing that the DSA does that has never been possible before is it allows us to ask independent questions of this new private internet. And that means we're going to be able to go into places like Kenya and say, oh, what's the effect of not having moderators that speak Swahili? What's the effect of not having AIs to pull down hate speech in Swahili? Or what's the difference in different dialects of Swahili? We need to be able to, because remember, dialectical differences cause wildly different outcomes in terms of the performance of these systems. AI is very brittle, especially the way Facebook has written it. And it means that it's we need to be aware of just how big the disparities are, even dialect to dialect, in terms of safety. The last thing I want to emphasize is the DSA focuses on a systems-based regulatory approach. That means instead of coming in and saying, this speech is good, this speech is bad, they say platforms need to disclose the known risks that they know. So for example, they know choices they've made with regard to virality around deprioritizing intentionality and sharing over just maximizing for the volume of sharing have serious consequences. They should have to disclose that research and tell us how they're going to mitigate that harm. This focus on systems-based interventions instead of individual pieces of content or ideas is really important because when we make our products safer, They're safer for every single person in the world, not just people who speak large languages.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Hogan, for being with us today. Actually, there is still a couple of more minutes, so I would like just to ask you maybe one small little more question in relation to the DSA, which is actually European legislation. How do you actually see this discussion on the DSA going outside, especially like in countries like we've just been mentioning, you know, like Kenya, Bosnia, or Indonesia? How to bring this discussion on such legislation like the DSA there? I know there's been now discussion with the US, or maybe that is starting, but how to bring this in smaller country, maybe like let's say where there has been less interest for the platforms as well.
So some of these questions around like which languages do the moderation AIs exist in, that impacts, so there are Swahili speakers who are in Europe, right? We need to remember that the harms of underinvestment in language diversity don't just impact people who live in African countries or in Southeast Asia. They impact every country in the world because we live in linguistically diverse countries. Like, we're not talking about linguistic monocultures. The second thing is that Europe has many smaller languages. Part of my family is from Norway and Denmark. And remember, there's only 5 million Norwegian speakers in the world. The questions of whether or not these products are designed for safety for smaller languages are very pressing for Europe, and they have wonderful spillover effects for other places of the world that might be experiencing more active ethnic violence. The last thing is the DSA can serve as a template for passing legislation in other places. So for example, you can imagine a coalition of smaller countries, maybe in South America, maybe in Africa, maybe in Southeast Asia, where you can imagine coming together as a coalition of maybe 200 million people. If you have a coalition of countries come together and pass a template law that's modeled on the DSA, it can become the law of the land in those places as well. Because the DSA focuses on more of a systems-based approach, instead of, you know, these ideas are good or these ideas are bad, it's much easier to apply it into a larger set of contexts.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And I think, well, that's a wrap. Thank you so much to our speakers for having accepted our invitation. Thank you again, Mrs. Hogan, for joining us remotely. I think we can definitely keep with us that there is a need to increase the localization of content moderation practices, that there is a need to reflect on global standards, on how to interpret them at local level. We need to work and continue working on more transparency and also empower users, as you mentioned, to promote and harness the power of social media even more. And well, as I just mentioned before, we will launch in the coming weeks some of these reports that we've been mentioning today. So we'll actually share them online and maybe organize as well some events in the different countries. Well, we hope to maybe even be able to present next year some further findings about what has happened, because this project is due to continue and to also be in other countries.
Hopefully Colombia.
Yes, exactly. Now I would just ask, before we close the session, if we could have this second video that I was just mentioning before.
Social media platforms have a unique ability to bring the world together for good. But they can also be a scary place, filled with misinformation, conspiracy myths, and hate speech. If people don't have the facts about the issues, it can be difficult to stop the spread. That's why UNESCO and the World Jewish Congress teamed up to inform social media users about one piece of history that cannot be denied: the Holocaust. Through aboutholocaust.org, we aim to provide the world with the basic facts and more about the Nazis' crimes, how they were able to carry them out, and the world's response. Now, together with Facebook and TikTok, we're taking further steps to bring reliable information to the masses. On Facebook, users who search for terms associated with the Holocaust in more than a dozen languages are prompted to learn more at aboutholocaust.org. TikTok has rolled out a similar feature, and individual posts referencing the Holocaust contain a notification encouraging viewers to visit the site. Learning about this important history can help prevent future genocides, acts of hate, and xenophobia. In a world of hate, there is no way to stop it all. When we come together, we can make a difference.
So thank you once again to the speakers. The World Press Freedom Day conference is just starting, so stay with us. We have an amazing program, and thanks again. Bye.